13 episodes. I don't know if
13
it's
episodes.
unlucky or not, but we'll find out.
I think it's super lucky, actually.
I hope. Oh, yeah.
I believe that bad luck is actually the best luck.
Okay. I don't know what that means.
I'll explain it another time.
Okay. We'll keep that for another time. But yeah, we are 13 episodes in. We conceived of this episode as kind of a look back podcast. And I'm thinking of this as like the big ideas episode. 1 year in, like, what are some of the big ideas that we can pull from? And I think it's also helpful for people who maybe are not so familiar with our podcast or maybe listening for the first time. They can hear some of the amazing people that we've had on over the last year. And hopefully they'll go back to those individual episodes. Does this sound like a good approach to you? Are you game?
I'm totally game. And I just want to build on not only a hope that they go back and they listen to the episode in its entirety, but they take it a step further and maybe look up the guests that we've had and get a personal understanding of the work that they've done. Maybe they become a supporter of the others. Maybe they become a partner with the others. Maybe they just reach out and say, I'm so grateful for you.
Yeah.
That would be another great outcome.
So, I want to get a little bit big ideas today, a bit philosophical. I shared a quote from E.B. White, and people can't see, but Rhonda has her mouth open in excitement. What was your reaction to this? And then I'll read it. Or maybe I'll read it. Here's the E.B. White quote. I arise in the morning torn between the desire to improve the world and a desire to enjoy the world. This makes it hard to plan the day. Your reaction, Rhonda?
I think you sent it because you're on the West Coast. You sent it at a time where I was asleep. And so it was one of the first things I read when I woke up in the morning. And I remember going, yes, exactly.
So I want to kind of weave this into our conversation. I want to bring it up at the top and then we'll loop back to it at the end because it's about wanting to take part in the world as it is and enjoy it, but also with that joy comes a responsibility and wanting to reach out and make the world a better place. This duality.
100%. 100%. And I also saw it as like, for me at least, a little bit of a rationale for why I feel so stuck sometimes. You know, the complexity of that duality can sometimes help me in my steps and in my thinking, you know, because that swing back and forth between joy and solution, joy and revolution can be pretty challenging. So it's that like holding multiple truths at the same time.
Let's dig into our first clip here. And it's from episode 4. And it's actually the conversation we had with our associate producer, Alyssa Morley, on disabilities. So I want to play you a clip and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So here goes.
I'm someone that's an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means I use a wheelchair, but I also use crutches to walk. The unique nature of disability is it's one of the only communities that you can just become a part of anytime, any day, at any point in your life. You could become injured or get into some accident or something at any time that could lead to a disability, or you could have, you know, some cognitive thing that happens, who knows. But if you get to a point where you are old enough, your physical abilities and your cognitive abilities are going to start declining. So it strikes me as just really short-sighted when people think like, oh, that's not something I have to worry about because it doesn't affect me. Well, at some point in your life, if you're lucky enough to get there, it will.
Thinking about our future selves, imagining the lives that we want to live can actually build connections with people around us because we can see how closely connected our lives are actually. So me being able to envision myself getting older, wanting to get out on the trails, but maybe not being able to, makes me think about, you know, my neighbor who might need to walk or use a wheelchair, you know, or might not be able to hike in the same way that we do. But what was your reaction to that quote?
Oh, man, I thought that was probably one of the realest things I've ever heard. I don't know how often folks take a pause to reflect on that truth because it's like indisputable. And There were several things on a very personal level that came to mind for me. And one of which was, having been in a car accident and being in a coma and having brain damage and having all kinds of like bodily harm that was done and how I had to recover, the process of recovery.
And before that accident, you were out there on the slopes, you're snowboarding like all the time. You're in nature all the time. And then the question, this accident happens, and then you're like, can I ever do that again?
100%. I mean, the accident happened the day of one of the best days I've had on the mountain. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to be able to, get back on the snowboard. At the time I was skiing, if I was ever going to get back on skis again. And there was one more thing that Alyssa said in that episode that I think about often too. And that is how myself and others, and maybe even you a little bit, talk about being in nature. And she pointed out the fact, just as she's sitting in her wheelchair and she's at home, just being able to look outside and experience nature from the window.
Most people around me are generally pretty outdoorsy people, and they go and do these amazing things, and it's easy to start to feel a little bit sad that, there's no way I could do that, right? Like, so I'm just sitting on my back porch, like listening to the birds or looking out the window, but it's not a competition, we can all enjoy the benefits and joys of the outdoors. And there are things that I probably will always wish I could do, but I can also be grateful that I have a big, beautiful window in front of me that I can look out of, or I can sit on my back porch and listen to nature or stand in the rain or whatever it might be. I've been reminding myself of that.
Looking at the trees, looking at the birds, watching the weather is also a form of being in nature, even though she's physically inside her house. And I think that's also something that we tend to overlook when we think about connecting folks with the outside. It also can be through your window. I wonder, Alyssa, we had talked previously about access to the outdoors, and you were sharing a story about a trip you took to LA recently.
Southern California beaches, and I have to say, just as a side note, Southern California was pretty accessible for me. It was very refreshing. When I went to the beach there, I used a beach mat for the first time. Now, I had seen people talking about beach mats and using them online, showing what they are and how they work, but I had never used one for myself until that day. And what I love so much about it is they've got this mat that, allows you to access the beach. And I think initially you think about wheelchairs and people on crutches. Both of those are me, but everyone was using that beach mat because it was one of those moments where it's like, people often want to say, like, why should we bother to put in these features that are going to cost money, that are going to be expensive and hard to get and whatever, but everyone can use them and everyone can benefit from them.
There's actually a frame or a term for this thing, and it's called the curb cut effect. And Angela Glover Blackwell, who is the founder of PolicyLink, wrote a whole article about the curb cut effect. And essentially, it's like when we put those curb cuts in our sidewalks, it was initially a result of, the American with Disabilities Act and making sure that sidewalks were accessible to folks in wheelchairs or using other walking devices or assistants. And it turns out that absolutely everybody benefits. And so the curb cut effect invites us all to think about the variety of conditions from an equitable standpoint that demonstrates that nobody loses, right? When you invest in one segment of our population, one group of people, there is a benefit for absolutely everyone.
In thinking about like connections and wanting to create access to nature for other people, another episode that really came up strongly for me was your conversation with Mickey Fern. We'll kind of use this as a transition point for the next part of our conversation.
We have a tendency to take people to nature, and then when they come back to their environment, they want to leave their environment. They want to get out of that environment because they've seen another possibility, but they don't come back thinking, how do I demand that my environment begin to reflect what I see in nature? How do I demand trees and green spaces and parks and And so how do I, rather than leaving my community, which means the problem continues to go on, rather than leaving my community and going somewhere else, how do I start making my community better?
Oftentimes when we are looking in neighborhoods where the residents are under-resourced, right? The neighborhoods that might not have the investments or simply don't have the investments coming from the city coffers. They haven't been prioritized. They've been marginalized again and again and again. Oftentimes when you're talking about those spaces, people are also competing with other needs that they have. So when you have this exposure, say we're talking about that segment of our population, okay, and you live in a neighborhood where you don't have all the amenities. There's food apartheid that's very active and alive. Maybe the school system is not at its best, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You go out into nature. You come back home into your neighborhood. You don't even know that you have a right to ask for these things. You figure to yourself, if I can't even get a grocery store in my neighborhood, who on earth is going to bring nature here? Because all of the policies and all of the activities that have existed thus far, generation after generation, told you that you weren't worth these good things, these nice things. And then in the situations where you start to see those investments, maybe there is a park that's being renovated, new amenities are coming through. That also sometimes can be a signal, which is not what Mickey is talking about, but that could also be a signal of something bigger that is to come in the form of development and gentrification or displacement. So I think that in some instances, it could be that people just don't realize they have a right to ask for it because they've never seen it in a neighborhood. They've never seen it in a community. And then in other instances, it can be people don't want to ask for it because that means that they're going to be potentially setting themselves up to be displaced from the neighborhood. And because the prices are going to go up, people are going to start becoming attracted, homes are going to start being bought out, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this really interesting tension there. But I think mostly it's that people don't realize they have a right to ask for it.
Another episode I want to talk about is the episode with Anton and Naomi. Do you want to give us a little recap of like your experience being in Chicago and a little bit about their work?
Chicago is such a massive city, and there are so many like ethnic pockets of Chicago. It has a really interesting form of segregation that exists. And when we went in to talk with Naomi and Anton, we went to Blacks and Green to have that conversation. And that whole neighborhood is on Chicago's South Side. It is just a majority Black community that has all kinds of activities happening in terms of urban gardens and reclamation of land. I think Inglewood has an Inglewood Land Trust where the residents are taking true ownership over their space, and they are determining what development is going to look like on their terms, what investment is going to look like on their terms, and how communities can, use their own resources to invest. And so building a green economy, owning the land, having a conservation lifestyle. I mean, there's just so much.
There's
tourism,
so much to that
there's
episode.
so much there.
What if the narrative about Black America was Black Americans live in beautiful, prosperous neighborhoods?
That's right.
And that prosperity isn't always tied to money.
And there you have it. Because in the first principle of Green Village Building, which we teach, is, your wealth. You define what your wealth is. You define what your currency is. You define where your repositories are. Look, why would you bank at a place that won't give you a loan? When we talk about self-determination, in the sustainable square mile idiom, we're talking about, can you walk to work, walk to shop, walk to learn, walk to play? Can you own the businesses, own the land, and live the conservation lifestyle where you are? No, we're not going anywhere. The land loss that Black Chicago has experienced in the last decade, it stops here.
So much there.
Yeah. And, one of the things that is, I think, implied in that clip that you played, and if it's not explicitly stated in that episode, it is something that's on my mind. And a lot of organizations, a lot of entities tend to refer to folks, particularly black folks in America. We use the language around low income. And what Blacks in Green and Grow Greater Inglewood are talking about is Black wealth, which is different. Income versus wealth. And people mistakenly use the language interchangeably, and that's not at all
right. Because wealth
correct.
Is intergenerational.
It's intergenerational. Much more important. That's right. And so they are reclaiming Black wealth, right? They are thinking about future generations. It is actually a sustainable approach, and sustainable not entirely in terms of like, renewable energy, et cetera, but sustainable for, as you mentioned, the generations to come, generation after generation, always having something to stand on so that they don't have to be reliant on these systems that are super discriminatory, continue to be discriminatory, and want to continue to deprive us of the opportunity to have the wealth.
Anton says prosperity isn't always tied to money. I love that.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of different ways we can think about being prosperous and having prosperous neighborhoods and neighbors.
100%. Like when we think about, the whole concept of the village and how critical that is, where that you can, your children can safely walk down the street to get their piano lesson from Mr. Green on the corner. And then from there, that child can walk across the street to the Black-owned market to grab some vegetables to bring home for dinner. And along the way, they can stop at their auntie's clothing store to pick up that. I mean, there's a whole...
it's amazing. Like, if that I close vision my is eyes wonderful. I know. It makes us so happy to think about.
Right.
And that's what they're trying to create. Yeah.
And that's what we used to have, until it all got blown up, right? When we think about Tulsa, we had all of those things. And then folks decided that we weren't worthy and they needed to destroy it and tear it to the ground, literally blow it up. And I think this is a great response to all of that just says, no, we're here. Like she says, we're not going anywhere. It's a very powerful episode. And I think the work that's happening there is just monumental.
I want to play another clip about systems. Anton talks about navigating systems and how maybe the systems aren't working for folks. So I have another clip I'd like to play for you.
I want to make sure the audience knows, especially any young people, that you're not of it. We are navigating. We are just navigating these systems. I don't believe in them. I am navigating them. Right? There are all kinds of forces that I want to be a part of that can help move, shift, transform, right?
That navigation is the agility that Black folks have, and that disabled folks have, and that all of us who have been marginalized, we have a level of agility that is unmatchable. And it's not only the agility, but it's the willingness to keep doing it over and over again, because we believe that we can be victorious over time, right? The endurance that we have to keep coming back to this, learning how to take a left and then do a duck and then take two rights, stand on the left foot, freeze, right? I mean, it's almost like a game. There's a mastery that exists for those of us who have to keep working through these systems. And I appreciated him saying he doesn't believe in them. It's all so contrived, right? These are all man-made, and they were all made. These systems were all created to keep the division. None of us are stupid. The folks who are sitting in the furthest parts of the margins are probably some of the most brilliant thinkers, because you learn how to do with less. We have a better sense of what truly isn't working, and the brokenness of those systems.
It reminds me of our episode that we did with Erica Hood and SIAT. SIAT is a nonprofit based in Cleveland, and they help create space for people to see themselves in nature. They create spaces for people to find Black joy in the outdoors. So I want to play a little snippet and get your reaction.
I think within our community is 1000%. One of the most important aspects of the work that we do is representation. So a lot of times, when you hear the phrases, that's white people stuff, that's not stuff that we do, we are just further distancing ourselves from that actual activity. So I just feel if we can allow our kids to see us in these roles, then they'll be able to see themselves in the role and not just think that it's a one-off activity or just, this was something that I was allowed to experience before I left that space to them. You know what I'm saying? So representation is super important. So we make sure that in everything that we do for SIAD, I may not be an expert at it, but I do it, I try it, and where I can be an expert or be certified at it, I am. My mom, like I said, she was older. When SIAD started, she was well into her 50s, but she was like, you know what? I have to give this a try because I want to be able to speak to this experience when a kid is coming to me with some challenges that they're having.
It's all about representation for them. What's your reaction?
There is a multitude of things that are rushing through my brain, and hopefully you can connect with it. One is me living in the Wasatch Mountains in Utah in the 90s. Being the only Black woman on skis and on snowboards there, and people questioning me all the time. Like, how did you get here? I was such an anomaly. And I was really offended by that initially, but it was also true. You just weren't seeing a whole lot of us out there, which to the best of my understanding, because it was in, I think, about 1998 when I learned of the National Brotherhood of Skiers. And I was in Utah at the time, and the boyfriend I had gone to Vail to shoot a wedding. He was a photographer. He went to Vail to shoot a wedding, and he called me and said, "You're not going to believe what I'm seeing. There are nothing but Black people everywhere, all over Vail." And I was like, is there a revolution? Is there like a march? Like, what is this all about?
Yeah, what's going on?
And he was like, there's this thing. It's called the Coalition of the Brotherhood of Skiers, or however he's phrased it. And so talk about representation. And so I did. I jumped in my car and I got to Vail in about 6 hours. And I was like, what on earth is going on? And the music across the mountain had changed. Every restaurant was playing like R&B, hip hop from time to time, right? And what I really loved were there were so many Black folks skiing on the mountain in jeans with long fur coats. And I was like, you know what? We're the best. We are so amazing. All that to say, there's different narratives that speak to who's doing what, and most of those narratives are false. We've always been here, but the recognition of that was really limited.
I want to play you another clip. This is actually from your conversation with Mickey Fern. He and his wife went to the Galapagos, and they went on I think a snorkeling trip.
Yeah.
And he said that his wife, went out and she was doing fine, but he was struggling a little bit, and I want to play this for you and get your reaction.
I don't know what this is.
Right.
I think when you get in the water, you got to swim. Right? You got to move your arms and your legs or you're going to sink. And I'm in like 12 feet of water and I'm looking at this going, and I'm actually doing what's in diametric opposition to what you need to do in order to be able to enjoy it. I watch these white people swim by with their arms behind their backs and they're just kicking and they ain't moving nothing. They're just like moving through the water. And I don't understand how that happens, right? So then, so the first time I was terrified. Then I went back the second and third time. By the third time, I was kind of getting it.
Yes.
Because my fear was going away, my techniques were getting better, and then I could acquiesce with the beauty. But see, here's another problem. If you're angry, or if you're afraid, or if you're unhealthy, it's almost impossible for you to acquiesce with beauty.
It's so fascinating. And this even ties to what we talked about earlier with Anton, identifying the different situations that we navigate in order to just kind of get through and persevere. It's amazing. Oftentimes I think about how we have to be contortionists often in order to fit into a situation. And we do it so that we can gain connection sometimes. Sometimes we do it because of our pride and our egos. Sometimes we do it because we want to shift a narrative and we want to prove something untrue or break the myth. about who we are as a people. And so I definitely resonate with that. I know that I have found myself doing things that I didn't necessarily want to do, but I did it to get close to a feeling of belonging. And I think at the root of a lot of the choices that we make, I think there's a root that's connected to just a desire to feel like you belong as opposed to feeling othered. So I appreciate the fact that they were willing to do something so uncomfortable and potentially even life-threatening.
The fact that I went at all was based on the fact that my wife and I were only two Black people on the boat.
Okay.
And we were going to have all these white people going back to their neighborhoods and saying there were two Black people on the boat and they never got in the water.
Okay. So representation.
Well, I'm thinking, it's crazy that I'm going to put my life at risk because I don't want these white people to go back and say.
But it's about those false narratives and representation.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
The experience of them being on this boat and going out with these strangers who were all white folks, I think about that as an opportunity for quality facilitation, where you can get grounded, you can ground the whole group in an experience of connection. Like, who are you and what's your story around snorkeling? Oh, I've never done it before, and here's the reasons why. In that moment, you can create an opportunity for another person to say, you know what, I remember the first time I went snorkeling and I was petrified. And I did it because, fill in the blank. But being able to create an opportunity to level set so that preparation that we talked about earlier, that comfort that we talked about earlier is actually the starting point. You can kind of diffuse some of these tensions or this pressure that we feel to kind of show up so that we don't become that story that seems to unintentionally perpetuate that myth about who we are and what we do and what we can't do,
We're at another kind of contract of what it means to be American. That is what I think this allyship you're talking about will move beyond just the racial construct, because what does it mean in this society that has this, wicked past that we're all trying to still work through because we're still here. But the experience of meeting people is completely different.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is the power of why the interchange of people being in place, even when you disagree, that you can still see them as humans.
Yeah, I think sometimes we can get so lost in an agenda or a set of objectives that sometimes we lose the value. And instead of starting with the value and having it be a shared experience, we get so caught up in our process and, what can we measure? How do we know this is successful? What is the story going to be? We create this whole architecture around an event or an experience where we end up losing sight of the whole impetus for us even wanting to take something on in the beginning.
You mean being present, being in the place, being surrounded by these people and coming at it with an open heart, just saying like, let's experience this together and see what happens?
Like, let's be agenda free. Let's just live into this space.
So I'd like to transition a little bit and talk about relationships with land. So I want to flag episode 8, where we talk to folks from the Penobscot Nation in Maine, land and stewardship, and different ways of viewing how we interact and care for the earth. And so I want to play you this quote from Darren from that conversation.
As a scholar and as a tribal person, is what has been a really vibrant part of the discussion around conservation since at least 2008, the notion that where Indigenous people are and where we have some element of control or power over our lands, our retained lands, that's where biodiversity exists, right? So we're actually understanding that some of the best conservation outcomes around the world are coming when Indigenous people's rights and leadership are endorsed, are sought out by conservation groups. So, I think that is a shifting practice, right, since 2008 in forms of recognition. So I think conservationists around the world have taken this up in an uneven way. So there's not a universal kind of a commitment to it. But I think as an emergent set of scholarship and practice, like we are seeing with each passing year, new scientific studies that support Indigenous leadership, Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous governance, and I could go through the list of the sources that produce the best conservation outcomes.
So I'll stop it there, but so relevant, so important. What struck you from that?
It's so funny. I had a conversation, meeting with one of my colleagues at TPL just this morning about relationship to land or concept of land. And I was suggesting that we don't have a relational dynamic. We have a more structural one, which is the reason why we find ourselves in these kind of dilemmas when we're talking about stewardship and the like. And, colonization is not only a practice, it's a mindset, and it's super pervasive. And one of the things that the colonized mind, that is, and one of the things that is almost laughable is the level of arrogance that has been perpetuated for centuries around this notion of indigeneity. We've got these folks traveling the United States, traveling the globe, telling people that their life ways were not in alignment with all of the things that they knew, that they assumed were better. And now we look at us in this climate crisis, and now everybody wants to kind of turn the page, go back in time, forget about all that stuff we said before. That wasn't really us. Those are the people that came before us. We didn't really think that. Anyway, by the way, do you think you can show us how to do this better?
You have some practices that seem to work. Would you like to share those with us?
Yeah. I mean, it's laughable because the level of disrespect that comes along with that mindset. And I know that folks are trying to be more honorable and recognizing, the land that we're on and the various ways that we're trying to make it right again.
For folks that are interested in learning more about what Indigenous stewardship practices look like on land, this is a great episode to listen to.
Yeah.
Darren is a scholar. Chuck he's in the woods. He's
a practitioner.
He's a practitioner. These types of practices are creating more spaces for biodiversity.
Yeah. I'm grateful that it's happening. I guess I'll say that outright. I'm really grateful to see this progression of recognition and practices, and even in some instances, looking at leadership. So I think very particularly about Secretary Deb Haaland and the Department of Interior, and just the tremendous impact that she's had under her leadership in protecting, conserving, promoting all of the things with Indigenous lands and lifeways. And I'm so grateful for her. And we're just slow. We're just slow on the take, right? It's amazing.
We could be quicker. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's just amazing to me that it took until, 2022, 2021, I think, when Secretary Haaland gained her position. 2021, right? So I'm happy that it's happening, and I'm grateful to her. She's really made a tremendous mark, but I'm also disappointed, I think, that it has taken us this far. And again, now we're having this conversation. We've got this Black woman who's running for president. Hello?
Unbelievable. Yeah. So this is another quote from Darren. And this is in the context of, we're talking about the Outdoors for All Act, and then a switch flipped in your head. And I'm going to play it now.
I think that oftentimes, at least in the context, the way I have been thinking about it, and we've been thinking about it maybe with the legislation or even at TPL, when we talk about everybody having a right to the outdoors, I don't know that we're thinking about it in terms of future generations and reflecting and honoring past generations. So now, for me, the definition of all just changed.
In terms of our ongoing sovereignty and caretaking responsibilities, that's the shift, right? I mean, it's, as you mentioned, the all includes future generations, but also with our non-human relations, because many Indigenous people, our clan systems are based around kin relations with animals and insects and all sorts of other things. So I think it's a really important understanding. Again, this is why is Indigenous caretaking stewardship different, is because those are the original instructions that we're acting out.
Those are the original instructions that we're acting out. Caretake the land, develop kin relations with all living beings, be in harmony with nature.
Period. I do remember that moment. I remember my whole body got flooded with a combination of emotion and also remembrance, because I think those were the instructions that my ancestors had too. And somehow hearing him articulate it, it came back to me. And when I think about, and when people ask me, how did you end up in this space? How did you end up in this sector? Sometimes my answer is not as straightforward as the one that I give. I think it started way before, and I don't really have evidence of that. I just know how it shows up in my body. And when Darren said that, it all came back to me like, yep, that's exactly right. That's right. What a beautiful thing. What a humbling thing. And imagine if everybody were to take a moment. And I want to be clear, by virtue of the fact that I drive a car, I don't have renewable energy. There are parts about my life that are not 100% in unison or unity, with the earth. There are choices that I make every day that are counter to what I think I should be doing, because I am a consumer. I live in this capitalist society. I love convenience. I love all of the assets that I have. And so sometimes I think I'm a walking contradiction, because my soul self knows better, right? But then my human self takes other actions instead.
Well, kind of like the E.B. White quote at the top, right?
Boom.
We want to enjoy the world, but we feel a need to help make things better.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
So I really encourage folks to go back to that episode 8, and listen to the messages from Darren and Chuck. It's a really powerful one. Thinking of people on the land, we talked about Naomi and Anton. We talked about Darren and Chuck. We talked about people going back and existing in nature as they had for centuries, or finding new ways to see themselves in an urban environment potentially, but still bringing history along with them, as Naomi and Anton have done, rediscovering that, reteaching those things, learning from the ancestors, carrying those forward. It reminds me of what we were talking about a few minutes ago about we're creating these frameworks, right, to figure out how to exist in the world a lot of times and with each other. But the other part of being with nature, from the E.B. White quote, is like being out there and enjoying it, which for a lot of folks means being present, just existing in nature, because those are the ways developing those relationships, either again or anew, is what keeps us engaged in the natural environment. It keeps us wanting to go out there. It keeps the imperative for protecting these things on the top of in our minds. So I want to go back to our beginning and your first interview with Tyche James.
I knew you were going there. That's awesome. But one of the things that I personally am interested in that we don't talk about very much in the broader stance of the great outdoors is birding. And I will say that for me personally, I love birds. I have commissioned artists to paint images of birds. I have one room in my house that has just birds imagery all over on all of the walls. I love them so much. And I can probably name 5. And I would never consider myself a birder. Can you help me and anybody else who's listening talk about what it means to be a birder? How does one qualify to become a birder?
Well, after you send in your application, it's a typical 6 to 12 week process. No, I'm just kidding. No such thing exists. I would say first, you probably, and I think this is true with most people, you know more birds than you think you do. Because I think you would know the difference between an owl and a crow. I think you'd know the difference between a robin and a pigeon. And then that's already 4. So yeah, I think you know more than you're letting on, and that's okay.
I will even real quickly say that I actually can distinguish between a crow and a raven.
Ooh,
so,
all right, levels.
Better than I think.
And I say that as much as we enjoy it, to talk about how it's not the knowledge of birds that make you a birder. It's the joy that you have and how you share it. And like what that was, that repartee, that was our joy. We were just sharing that. Or that's what makes you a birder. That's what makes this a birding experience. Not the knowledge that we have, not the life list that we get. You know, it's all about the joy and how we share it.
Does that take you back or what to episode 1?
It does. It gives me like a certain fondness, because that was, I think, being the first one was the scrappiest. And I played the music from my phone, I think, in the background. Like everything about it was super scrappy, right?
It was.
And so I appreciate that origin story and that joy, right? That really is at the root of it in so many ways. So it's the relationships, with the non-humans. It's the joy that just gets naturally, organically evoked when we have these experiences with the non-humans and also the humans. And it also reminds me, some folks have heard me share this a few times, reminds me of a critical lesson learned from a colleague of mine. And I might have brought this up in an episode. I don't remember. Somebody was talking about hiking. They said they wanted to go on a hike. And what they were referring to was like walking along a path that was like adjacent to a lake or something like that. It was like a 2-mile path around a lake. And they had referred to it as a hike. And at that point, I had spent my decade living in the Wasatch Mountains. I was completely indoctrinated with this outdoor lifestyle, which meant that I wore certain brands. I dressed a certain way. Mm-hmm. I learned a certain language. And I had said to this person, like, oh, well, you don't want to go on a hike. You want to go on a walk. And the person was like, it's whatever I call it. Mm. And it just put me in my place, Like, who says what a hike is? Who said that? Who made that up, right? It's about us moving our bodies outside and having that joy. Mm. And I'll never forget that, and it's stuck with me ever since. And I try to be very cognizant of the language that I'm using when I'm talking about engaging with the outdoors, because it wasn't about the name of the thing. It wasn't about the type of shoe that we wore. It was about what we were going to experience being in community together outside.
We just talked about Tyche James, episode 1, but for this episode, we started out with that E.B. White quote. So I want to read it one more time, just because it's where we started, and it's what I'm going to take into tomorrow for sure. I arise in the morning torn between the desire to improve the world and a desire to enjoy the world. This makes it hard to plan the day. Okay, thank you, E.B. White, and thank you, Rhonda, for taking this time, for doing this year of podcasting with me. I've learned so much. It's an honor to work with you.
And thank you too, Tom. It's nice to look back on these, and it's amazing to hear the things that have actually stuck in my mind without having to go back to listen to them. There are a lot of seeds that have been planted over the last year that have taken root, and I'm grateful that they haven't left my mind and they haven't left my spirit. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation. So thank you for thinking of it. Yeah. People, Nature, Big Ideas is produced by the Trust for Public Land in partnership with Pretty Good Productions. Our executive producer is Thomas Clayton Miller. Our producer is Vanessa Martin, and our associate producer is Alyssa Morley. Our theme song was produced by Tall Black Guy Productions. And if you like the show, please leave us a rating on iTunes and maybe mention us to a friend or two. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you the next time.